Hello, welcome to Leverton on Politics. This is my second episode. The first episode was entitled Trump versus Canada, and now we're going to do, I guess this is a series now, we're going to do Trump versus Ukraine. And I would like eventually to do one episode just about the phenomenon of Trump himself. But I think in this particular moment, the focus has really been on his foreign policy, or lack thereof, and there are questions if he is a Russian agent or not because of some of his actions. So I'm going to divide this into two parts. The first part, I'm going to explain why Trump's kind of connections to Ukraine, because they go back farther than this particular point. And I'm going to talk about how Trump could have been more successful in his ambitions if we accept on that he really doesn't like war and that he wants to stop it. If we accept his if we accept his premise, or if we accept his statements at face value, then what he could have done to make those statements come true. The first part, Trump versus Ukraine. So how did we get here? It's a little bit of a complicated story, and I think, unfortunately, in our era of 15-second bites on TikTok, people are influenced by like this 15-second narrative, something that they can understand very quickly, but life is all about these nuances. So a podcast is a good area, a good media to give you a broader picture. So Trump in Ukraine doesn't actually start right now, or even into 2016. It starts in the events before 2014. So if you don't remember, 2014 is when there was a shadow invasion of Ukraine by Russian forces, and they annexed Crimea and eastern parts of Ukraine. And that was followed almost 10 years, but not quite 10 years later, by the invasion, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia in 2022. Why did that happen? And that's a complicated question as well, but basically, since the end of the Cold War and Ukrainian independence in 1991, there were a lot of Ukrainian governments that functioned kind of like Russian governments. They were very corrupt, there was, these oligarchs, and they were very pro-Russian, kind of like the situation in Belarus, except that in Belarus, it's been one person in charge since the end of the Cold War, which is crazy. Lukashenko has been in power since 1991, I think even before then, so that's insane. Putin came on the picture in 1999, and he became the president of Russia, I think in 2000. So he's been the president of Russia for about 25 years now. What happened, back to the Ukrainian part of the story, also Putin is a fascinating character, and I think he's probably one of the most, unfortunately, successful politicians of our era. And I think just to dive into all of the things that he's done and his strategy will also be the topic of another episode. But back to the story. So Ukraine, eventually, Ukrainians had tired of this corruption, and they protested, and they had an orange revolution, and they drove out the Russian oligarchs. But he was still, the guy was still around. Yukonovich or something like that. Sorry, I might get a bunch of names wrong, but Yukonovich was one of the Russian kind of stooges in Ukraine, supported heavily by Ukraine. So he was voted out of power, and the guy who replaced him, the Russians tried to assassinate by poisoning him, and they disfigured his face, and they kind of made him into a folk hero. But eventually another election was held where this Russian stooge Yanukovych, he was elected again. And this is the crazy part. So basically there were some economic negotiations, and there was a chance for Ukraine to become closer to Europe economically, and he said no. And that was the spark that caused the protest in Ukraine and Euromaidan and all of that, because basically the majority of Ukrainians wanted a closer relationship with Europe. And it was only an economic thing. They weren't, but the reaction to those protests was more and more violent, and basically the president ran away to Russia, where he still lives for a long time there, since I think about 2012, or maybe even before then. So that happened. And now there's this story that the CIA supported this coup against the democratically elected government of Ukraine. And who's to say if that's true or not? I mean, I'm not in the CIA, so I can't tell you. But you have to think, like, what strategic objective would that give to the United States? Like, for Europe, certainly it would have been great. But no one claims that European intelligence agencies funded this. So when you think about like covert operations, you have to think about like what is the goal and how does that ultimately benefit American interests. So weakening Russia does benefit American interests for sure. So you could say that it was supported by Americans. But if we go back to the Bay of Pigs, there are things that have been supported by Americans that were not successful because they weren't supported by the people of that country. So even if it turns out that there was some CIA funding, it was massively popular in the country, and it led to a big change in the outlook of the Ukrainian government. And it was democratically elected, there was like a new constitution and all of that stuff. So at that point, basically, Putin has lost control of Ukraine, and he thinks, how can I take back control of Ukraine? There's all of these areas in Ukraine that have Russian speakers, and so he uses propaganda to say that the government in the West are a bunch of Nazis, and they want to kill Russians, and it's a massively successful propaganda campaign, which leads eventually, as I said earlier, to this shadow invasion of Ukraine by the Russian government. And they were saying, oh, no, it's not us. It's these little green men, and it has nothing to do with us. And that happened in 2014. Let's leave it there for a moment, because the Ukrainian story gets more and more complicated. If we're talking about Trump in Ukraine, that's the basic backdrop of the beginning of the story. Trump wins the election in 2016 as the result of a lot of factors. So, luck, incompetence on the part of his adversaries, also a massive and continuing Russian PSYOP campaign to destabilize the American government, which was effective. Trump is elected, and it's 2016, so it's crazy that that's almost 10 years ago. So a lot of people who elected him in 2024, don't remember this part, because if they remembered it, they wouldn't have elected him. So he was massively unpopular. He was very corrupt, still very corrupt, and he was using the power of the American government to his economic advantage, and it was pretty clear what he was doing. But he also benefited from the fact that the American economy was going really well because of the decisions of his predecessor. There's a lot of factors, more factors, why he was so successful. Another thing, of course, would be that he was able to mobilize the politically illiterate and politically disadvantaged classes of America. That's why he won in 2016. But by the next election in 2020, of course, there was the pandemic, but I think this happens later in our story. So he is looking for, he realizes that his rival was going to be Joe Biden, and Joe Biden, surprisingly for such a career politician, had this kind of like good, chummy vibe, like, oh, grandfatherly, avuncular, perhaps. So he had this image of being this avuncular man, and it's clear that he would win against Trump. Should the Democrats have selected Biden? That's a question for another day. But he did win the election, so in that particular moment, he was a good choice. Going back to Trump was like, well, how can I ruin this guy's reputation? Which is weird because Trump is a guy who is reputationless, by which I mean he has the worst possible reputation. He's done crimes, he's morally corrupt, criminally corrupt, and people who work with him for a long time don't actually like him. But there are this dedicated base of people who ignore all of that and say like he is this messiah figure, which is crazy and mind-blowing. But other politicians are still playing, and they're still viewed by the public with the other rules. Like I remember during the last election, I'm not an American, but I would have voted for Kamala. But I was talking to somebody and she was like, oh, Kamala can't give a good speech. So probably, and the suggestion was I wouldn't vote for Kamala. It's like, that's craziness. When you look at Donald Trump and his I'm eating the dogs thing, like, it's crazy double standards. People who run against Trump need to have these sterling reputations and have, no skeletons in their closet because they need to be morally perfect, but Trump, for whatever reason, doesn't need to be. So anyway, back to Ukraine. There was this rumor that Biden's son Hunter was involved in some shenanigans in Ukraine, and Trump basically said, not to Zelensky, but the previous government before him, said to that government, like, you give me intel on the corruption of the Biden family, and I will stop withholding this support for you because this war was going on since 2014, and this is at least 2 years, 3 years later. So the war was continuing and nobody was really winning. The Ukrainian government said no for a couple of reasons. First, because they didn't want to be bullied, but also because probably there wasn't evidence of the Biden crime family's, corruption, because that was a myth. And not to say that every member of the Biden family was a morally virtuous paragon, but, because Hunter did have some problems, but it wasn't corruption on the scale of Trump. So that action, I should pause on that because I'll tell you about the ramifications of that action later because it's important for this story. But to go back, in 2016, when Trump was elected, there were a lot of rumors of Russian collusion. Basically, the idea was that the Russians were supporting this political campaign and they hacked into email servers and they stole something that would damage the reputation of the Democratic candidate. People still talk about Hillary's emails. So basically what Hillary Clinton did, and this is the thing that sunk her career, which is amazing in retrospect. Hillary Clinton, when she was Secretary of State, she had emails on a private server, which is a no-no in a security sense. So she had emails on a private server, and the government was like, hey, you can't do that. That's not good security violation. So she deleted the emails from the private server, And for her opponents, this was like, political corruption on a grand scale. She's erasing evidence. Yeah, that's what we call irony, because later, of course, Donald Trump would just blatantly steal classified documents and not give them back. That was the important part, because, sometimes American presidents misplace classified documents. A little bit terrifying, but when that's pointed out, they have a certain amount of time to give them back, and Trump was like, no, I'm not doing that. Craziness. Back to the Russian collusion thing, it wasn't ever conclusively proven that Donald Trump was guilty of collusion with the Russians, but he definitely met with them. He met with Russian secret agents, and they proposed whatever plan, they talked about whatever plan, and during the campaign, he said to the Russians in public, hack Hillary so we can have evidence of their corruption. So basically, he invited a foreign power to commit espionage in his own country for his own benefit. The Mueller report, I think that it recommended some actions, but they couldn't actually charge anyone with a crime. Officially, there was no charge against Trump or his campaign, but in the same campaign, which has been proven, and this is why Trump was convicted, Trump used campaign funds to bribe, and the crazy thing is that he didn't really need to do this in retrospect, but I think he thought that he was playing according to the rules of previous politicians. So he bribed a porn star that he had a relationship with to stay quiet. And according to American electoral law, you can't use, which is weird, because that's another crazy story, because apparently this would be legal, completely legal, if he hadn't used his campaign funds. But he used the campaign funds to bribe this lady to say that she had no relationship with him. So that's one thing that we definitely know happened during that campaign in 2015. I don't think it's a big stretch to say that other shady shenanigans were going on at that time. So, like with the Russians. And it's a big question, does that mean that Trump himself is a Russian asset? And that's difficult to say, because on the one hand, if it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, and swims like a duck, it's a duck. But I think Trump is a goose, by which I mean he is a waterfowl, because he displays all of the behaviors of being a Russian asset, but I think that he is not actually technically a Russian asset. He is just incredibly vain and narcissistic, and does not understand the complexities and nuances of modern political life. By which I mean, he had this experience of somewhat colluding with the Russians, and his opponents used that to attack him. And in his mind, because he doesn't understand the nuances of collusion or loyalty to anyone, he felt that this was an unfair attack on him. And so because the Democrats were attacking him for being supported by the Russians, he thought, therefore, the Russians must be the good guys, right? And anything they say must be correct. Yeah, so I think that he's been pro-Russian since that attempt to stop his political career, and I don't think that it's a nuanced position. I think that he's just pro-Russian because the Russians are pro-him. Why are the Russians pro-him? Because he is an agent of chaos, and that is to their advantage. That was kind of the preamble to him trying to pressure the Ukrainian government to provide dirt on the Biden family. He was already predisposed to accept the Russian point of view. He thought, the Russians are saying that there is this, criminal connection between the Bidens and Ukraine, and that Ukraine is this immoral fascist state. It's probably true, and I can just put pressure on the Ukrainians to deliver me some kind of evidence of this. And the Ukrainians said no, because they didn't want to be bullied, as I mentioned, and probably there was no evidence of this fact, or theory rather than fact. So then the Congress got involved, and there was an investigation of this thing, and basically Donald Trump was trying to extort Ukraine into giving him what he wanted for his own political advantage, not the political advantage of the United States or anyone like that. Even if it was true that the Bidens were a crime family, he wasn't doing this for the good of the country. It was to further his political career. And he broke the law. There was an investigation and an impeachment. I think that this impeachment is actually what broke America. And I think historians will go back and they'll look at this point in time and they'll say, because the fall of Rome is dated differently. So some say it's like the sacking of Rome, and some say it was like some other thing, the death of the last Roman emperor or something like that. So I think when we talk about the fall of the American Empire, we're going to point to this moment and say, when the senators refused to convict someone who was clearly a criminal and did criminal things in office, that's when the American democracy died and stopped functioning. Everything that happened after is just a consequence. So basically, the impeachment vote was just divided by team rather than morality or justice or rightness or whatever. So the team with the most votes won, basically. And ironically, a lot of those people who were in Congress when they voted this impeachment deal, they are no longer there because they've resigned or they are morally disgusted at what happened after. But this is the point where they could have stopped it. They could have been people of character and they could have stepped up. But no, Trump was a popular figure among their base, so of course Trump must be right, because popularity, unfortunately, in America equates with power, but it doesn't equate with being morally correct or even not a criminal, right? Because you can be very popular and still be a criminal, which is the case for Trump. Yeah, so there was another impeachment because of the January 6th thing, but if we're only focusing on the Ukrainian aspect of the story, this is why Trump doesn't like Ukraine, because of this. And what does he call it? He's like, I've been persecuted by my enemies. He thinks that Ukraine is a part of this persecution because he's really that self-centered that he thinks the world is all, focused around him and what he's doing. And unfortunately, he's right for the past 10 years, whatever. But yeah, he's right about that part, the world being focused on him. But he's not right that there is this vast conspiracy against him. It's only the result of his own actions. And in terms of Ukraine and Russia, it doesn't really have much to do with him. When he was defeated, and this is another part of this whole story which is terrifying and fascinating. So when he was defeated, of course he said he wasn't defeated, and the right-wing media sphere in the United States created this narrative like everybody's against Trump and there's no evidence, and it's crazy that anybody would ever say this guy who is just a paragon of virtue and a moral, upstanding family man, that they would ever think that he was a criminal. And then it got to be, because Americans are at this point, like there's lots of historical parallels. On the one hand, it parallels the collapse of the Republican Rome, but it also parallels later in Roman history when the empire was more focused on Constantinople, and you have like these teams like the Reds and the Greens. So there was like these chariot teams in Constantinople, and they would have different colors for the chariot teams, but they were also political parties, right? So you supported the Reds, you supported the Greens, and then they had some things that they supported, in connection with the emperor and foreign policies, domestic policies, all of that. So now you have, like in Byzantine, in the Roman Empire, in the later stages, you have these not people who are working even on the basis of ideology, because ideology, I don't think ideology is something to mourn over, but at least when you had previous generations of politicians, you had free market ideologists, you had big government ideologists, you had that kind of dynamic. But now it's just my team is right, your team is wrong, because it's my team, that's why it's right, My team is always right, your team is always wrong, that's just a fact. So you have that kind of dynamic in the American media landscape. It is more one side than the other, although it does affect everyone. And so you have this kind of repeating, this feedback loop where one side is against the other side, and the other side did this, so therefore that is bad. And I think that's what happened in Ukraine in the American media landscape. So basically Biden was the Antichrist because he is against Trump, and we all know that Trump is the greatest American ever. So he was against Trump, and Putin invaded Ukraine, in full-scale invasion in 2022. And in the beginning, American conservatives were like, what are you doing? You can't invade another country like that in 2022. And for maybe about a year, they were like, yeah, we support Ukraine against Russia. This is like ridiculous. But the Biden government was giving Ukraine money and more money and guns and weapons and supporting them, and the Europeans were doing too. And eventually, I don't know when, but it turned in American conservative media. It turned from being like, this is poor people who are fighting against oppression, and they're fighting against their oppressors, and they're rebelling against the big evil empire. So it turned from that to, okay, the Ukrainians are corrupt and they're stealing our money, and they should have never started this war. And you had to think like, well, how did that happen? Well, it happened through numerous factors that all kind of converged together. One was this media landscape, but also, as I said earlier, this is a Russian PSYOP campaign. It's psychological. So they want to sow division, and they especially want to kind of justify their invasion of Ukraine. Then they're going to justify it by saying the Ukrainian government are Nazis, and they're going to justify it by saying, the Russian speakers in Ukraine, there's like an ethnic genocide against them, and you can't trust the Democrats because they're corrupt and Ukraine is corrupt. Therefore, anytime you give money to them, it's just corruption. To be fair, I don't think that it is possible for a country to be given that amount of money and not have corruption. And you can see that there is some corruption in Ukraine society, and there are some stories of people, being fired by the government because they were taking bribes or they were embezzling. All of that is true. But then it's a much more complicated, nuanced thing, because I have a lot of thoughts in my mind, but is Ukraine more corrupt than the average American is willing to stomach? Yes, probably. But is Russia worse? Yes, definitely. Like Vladimir Putin is unofficially, but probably in fact, the world's richest man. That's how corrupt Russia is. Nuance has died in American political discourse because you have these people who went to Kiev and they're like, why are there still rich cars here? this is a country at war. It's like, well, or they didn't go to Kiev, actually. They went to Lviv, which is a country on the far west, city on the far west, right next to Poland. And so they went to Lviv, where there occasionally are bombings, but they went there and they were like, yeah, rich people have nice cars here. Like, how did that happen if they're at war? And why are we spending so much money to support Ukraine? So to go back a little bit, like to kind of answer that question, they spent so much money to support Ukraine because it was in the Americans' best interests to make Russia pay for bad decisions. And there's two reasons for that. One, because Russia is a rival for the United States, so you want your rivals to be as weak as possible. That's just a fact in politics. And the second is because if Russia succeeds in this invasion of Ukraine, then what's to stop China from invading Taiwan? And Taiwan has a much bigger economic impact on the United States than Ukraine does. So those were the political reasons why supporting Ukraine was beneficial for the American government. And of course, that's throwing out the morality of the whole situation, which is, you're supporting a country against people who are invading it, which generally has played well with the American public. Not in this case, because of all of the things that I mentioned earlier about this sort of weird media landscape where truth has died, nuance has died, and it's only my team, yes or no, right or wrong. I don't care. If my team wins, then that's good for America, which it is not, but that's a different topic. And of course, people tried to point out the fact that this actually benefited the United States because older weapons were being shipped to Ukraine, and then weapons manufacturers were making more weapons in the United States, and that provided jobs, and that was good for the American economy, which is true. But the war kept on going and going, and this kind of PSYOP campaign combined with the weirdness of the American media landscape created this impression that one, Ukraine was corrupt and Ukraine was responsible for this war. Ukraine was taking advantage of the United States, whereas the opposite was true. The Americans were taking advantage of the situation to repair some things that needed to be repaired, to update America's arsenal, and also weaken Russia and send a strong message to China. One argument that has come up is like, well, how can we support Ukraine if we have homeless people in the United States? How can we support Ukraine if we have all of these people who can't afford to go to university and etc.? And it's kind of conflating the problem, because you're conflating two separate problems. So America does have a lot of issues, internal, domestic issues with this, but I think those people really needed to ask themselves, they won't, but they should, like, what happens if we don't give this money to Ukraine? Basically what would happen is there would be the possibility of Russia expanding this war to kind of reconstitute the Soviet Union and perhaps maybe reconstitute Europe as it was during the Cold War. Perhaps. We don't know what the end of Vladimir Putin's ambitions are. So in that situation, up until about a week ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, you could say that that was what would happen if we don't support Ukraine. However, a few days ago, there was Volodymyr Zelensky went to the Trump White House because basically Trump negotiated this deal with Russia, not with Ukraine, for all of the reasons I mentioned previously, and basically said, here, take this deal and there will be peace. And then Zelensky said, I can't take this deal. Sorry, I can't take this deal. And then basically he was attacked, and a weird situation probably has never happened in the history of American politics, where, and it was all televised too. Probably these things have happened many times but not been televised, but that's another aspect of Trump's persona, is that he wants everything to be televised. So Trump berated Zelensky and said, this war has cost so many lives and it's your fault, and you don't want to accept this deal, so therefore you are the aggressor in the situation. I mean, he didn't say aggressor, but he said basically some weird thing. So there were two weird parts of that conversation. I mean, the whole conversation was weird, but the first weird part was Trump saying that defending your country could lead to World War III. And that's crazy because he's the president of the United States. He could theoretically create World War III if he wanted to. So it's a weird comment to make. And all that Zelensky is doing is defending his country. You can say, is he doing a good job of that? You can criticize him for that. And then he says that Zelensky is a dictator because they haven't had any elections, which is really crazy because, first of all, he said that he wanted to be a dictator, so are dictators good or bad now? If my enemy is a dictator, then that's bad, but my friend being a dictator is fine, because as I said, Putin has been in power for 25 years. How is that not a dictatorship? One of Putin's best friend has been in power since 1991. How was that not a dictatorship? Zelensky is just a dictator because that is the constitution of Ukraine, that they can't have any elections during the war. And if Trump had a nuanced view and was interested in learning about the world, then he would know that, but he doesn't have a nuanced view. He has a view of, these are my enemies, these are my friends. Well, maybe friends is a strong word. These are my enemies. These are people I can do business with, and my enemies are pretty clear. My enemies are people who are against me. And for all of the reasons I said, Ukraine fits that bill. So that's why there was this attack on him. And the other weird part was J.D. Vance saying, have you ever said thank you to the American people? And he said thank you a lot. But it's a really telling statement because Zelensky never thanked Trump. And you might say, well, why does he need to thank Trump? Trump wasn't president during that time. Well, in Trump's mind, he needs to thank Trump because Trump is the real ruler of the United States. It doesn't matter if he's president officially or not. Basically, J.D. Vance also said in that interview, you supported our domestic adversaries. Something like that. He may have even phrased it like that, which is weird because basically the support was him thanking Joe Biden, right? Him thanking the American people, the Congress. He thanked everyone in Congress, including J.D. Vance. It was weird that he phrased it like that. But basically, in their mind, if you do something nice for people we consider our opponents, you are the enemy, right? That's where that whole thing came from. And it has this impression that, of course, Trump is this Russian asset. Of course, he's Krasnov. He doesn't need to be Krasnov to do what the Russians want. And the Russians were actually surprised by this whole thing. They never expected an American president to just come out and be that way. Because, actually, if you go back, Trump himself put sanctions on Russia. It's not a case of he unequivocally does pro-Russian things. So yeah, that is the very complicated history of why basically Trump is not pro-Ukraine, and it's all about his neuroses and stuff. So that's the first part of this episode. The second part of the episode is how could he have actually done a better job with this. The problem is that Trump is not competent by any stretch of the imagination. And I do feel, however, like I think that Trump is a really fascinating guy, because if you listen to him talk to people who he admires but are not politicians, he's very gracious, right? And he has this way of talking to people that make them feel good and valued. He doesn't value them at all, but maybe he does in that moment. And that's like a great characteristic. It's really nice. He does have some positive attributes, but they're hidden under this mass of corruption and moral ineptitude and ineptitude generally. So one positive aspect of his character is that I think this is a genuine belief that he has, is that he does not like war, right? He didn't like the war in Iraq, he didn't like the war in Afghanistan, and he doesn't like the war in Ukraine. And I think that he genuinely doesn't like when people are murdered, which is, in war. Which seems like a crazy thing to give him credit for, because that should be the feeling of all people. But in America, it's not so simple. Because you have people who now are applauded for their not being Trump, like George Bush Jr., but he basically destroyed 2 countries, and he could have just arrested a terrorist, right? But he destabilized the Middle East because one person tried to kill his father, basically, and he was surrounded with people who wanted war. So there are people who did not care how many people died because they wanted to recreate the Middle East in kind of their image, because they wanted money and they wanted profits, and they didn't care about all the death and destruction. So I think he genuinely disagrees with that, which is something unique for a Republican politician, and he's kind of remolding the Republican Party, and it's not that party anymore. So here we are, and he said that he would end the Ukraine war in 3 days. His plan was what we saw. His plan was basically to agree to everything the Russians want and extort some kind of mineral deal and cash, because he's a very transactional person, and he said that all of this money that Americans were giving to Ukraine is like a loan, and this will just be like paying back. But if Ukraine had actually accepted those terms, that would mean bankrupting the country for generations. In fact, the loan would be bigger than the Germans were forced to pay in reparations, and that actually led in part to the Second World War. It's crazy that he would ask that. It's not crazy that he would want to stop the war. And I think another thing that I don't quite agree with is the fact that there's been this pushback, like you absolutely 100% need to support Ukraine. And personally, I think that people should support Ukraine because they're being attacked and they're being invaded, and if they don't stop Russia, then basically we're next. So Russia won't stop until Europe has been devastated. But that being said, there is no rule that the American government or Americans as a whole need to support Ukraine. If they decide they don't want to support Ukraine, it's fine. I mean, it's not fine for the Ukrainians, but they have that right, because they're an independent country and they can make their own foreign policy. And even if their allies support Ukraine, then they can still make that decision. And if Donald Trump was So I think, as I said, I think he was genuine about wanting peace in Ukraine, but his offer was ridiculous and incompetent. So if you want peace in Ukraine, I think that there is a deal that both parties would agree to. The first thing would be that both the Russian and Ukrainian militaries would have to withdraw from the disputed territories. So Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Crimea. So they would have to withdraw. And the Russians would have difficulties because of the base in Crimea, but they would have to withdraw their military forces. And those areas would be demilitarized for a period of, let's say, 10 years. It could be longer, 15 years, 20 years, whatever. Those people could then decide in a legitimate referendum which country they wanted to belong to. Because, well, the Russians would say, well, we already had a referendum, but the referendum was after you invaded, and it was in the middle of a war, so it probably was not the most, and, Russia's not the most democratically transparent country. So if you had this referendum that was, I don't know, monitored by some third party, like the European Union, although, Russia wouldn't trust the European Union, but the Swiss, the Canadians, the Australians, or even the Chinese. I mean, Chinese are not very big on democracy, but some neutral third party that the Russians and the Ukrainians would have to agree to, and they have a referendum. And after the referendum, those regions would go where they wanted to, without any ethnic cleansing, without any war. Because the problem, as I said before, the Ukraine situation is very complicated, but the country of Ukraine, as it's constituted now, was created by the Soviet Union. And it was created in such a way that it was an ethnic mix of Ukrainians and Russians. And, for example, Crimea was part of Russia for a long time, and it was just added to Ukraine by Khrushchev, because Khrushchev was the premier of the Soviet Union and also Ukrainian. The country, no country in the Soviet Union was created sort of naturally. Like they're the product of ethnic cleansing, of wars, of civil wars, and all of that. So the future of Ukraine, unfortunately, I don't know, but unfortunately the future of Ukraine is being decided now on the battlefield. And it's kind of negotiation by bullet. And I think that is not actually going to solve the problems of Ukraine. So the Russians withdraw in my vision of a deal, and the Ukrainians withdraw in my vision of a deal, and then policing is done by some neutral party. Then you have a referendum, and then those areas can go where they want. Well, how do you enforce this deal? Because, the Russians could renege on, as they have reneged on other deals. Well, you have to give the Russians something. And what the idea of so basically that Ukraine would declare neutrality and not join NATO, that's not going to work. Ukraine's not going to agree to that. There is another question, which is, will actually NATO exist in the future? But yeah, that's a different question entirely, and I don't know the answer to that. But so you have to give them something that the Ukrainians are going to agree to, and the Russians would agree to. The Ukrainians would agree definitely to the Russians leaving those territories, even if they were not technically part of Ukraine yet. And so how would you get the Russians to leave if they're already there? I think you can just say, we're going to remove all of the sanctions on you. And that would help Russia rebuild its economy. And if you think sanctions aren't any big deal, so the Russia is like one of the most highly sanctioned country in existence right now. It's more sanctioned than North Korea, right? So removing those sanctions would actually be a huge thing for Russia because, and you might say, well, we need to keep punishing the Russians for what they did to Ukraine, but at some point, I think Trump is right that you really do need to stop the war because it's a stalemate and nobody is winning and just people are dying. So you need to stop it, but you need to create some kind of situation where it will actually be beneficial for all parties to stop. And I think that that would be the conditions. For Russia, it would be no more sanctions. For Ukraine, it would be removal of Russian forces from Ukraine. And then some kind of, for both of them, some kind of referendum about the future of those territories. And then everything else, you can't actually say. You can't say that there'd be a guarantee for Ukrainian sovereignty when we know there was a guarantees earlier and, no one went to war with Russia. So that's not going to fly. You can't say that Ukraine's not going to join NATO because Ukraine is still an independent country and they can make that decision if they want to or not. In fact, it would be better if there was this deal and then Ukraine did join NATO because then Russia wouldn't attack, assuming, of course, if NATO is still a thing in the future, which is questionable at this moment. So that would be what I would want the negotiations to evolve into. And you would need, also having negotiations between Russia and the United States about the future of a third country. That's weird. You would need the Ukrainians to be involved, the Russians to be involved. I think, unfortunately, if we could go back in the past, then the Americans would be involved and the European Union would be involved too in those negotiations. But those would be the things that probably I feel would create a situation where the Russians would be comfortable finishing the war. But unfortunately now, Trump has done what he's done, and I don't think anyone trusts him, including the Russians. So I don't think that they're going to be invited to whatever negotiations happen to end the war. In conclusion, in the first part of the episode, I mentioned why Trump has problems with Ukraine. I think most of his problems are self-created and fed by jealousy, and maybe not jealousy, but fed by his own sort of narcissism. He believes that Ukraine is one of his enemies. He's not going to support Ukraine. So the second part of the episode, to make it clear, I don't think that there is any moral or ethical requirement that the United States support Ukraine. It would be great if they did, but they've already given them a lot of support. But I think if Trump is genuine in his desire to end the war in Ukraine, and I think partially he is, the way that he went about it was ridiculous and incompetent. You need some kind of negotiated peace deal, and peace deals always involve the people who are fighting the war. So Ukraine and Russia primarily, and then you need people who are interested in the conflict. So the European Union, the United States, even Turkey. Turkey's a fascinating country as well. And there's so many topics that this raises, like what is the future of NATO then? Is there a future for NATO? Can NATO survive Trump? Does this mean that the world is now different? So I will talk about those issues in the future. But yeah, that has been Trump versus Ukraine.